All right, welcome in, Paddy King. So we've been acquaintances for a while, albeit virtually, but
Yep.
we've had a lot of our paths has crossed quite extensively, which was just a coincidence in itself. So yeah, we have some listeners on today. If you why don't you give a brief background on yourself? I know it quite well, but I know everybody's going to be really excited about maybe how we know each other quite well, and then just a little bit about yourself. And then we had some questions that were sent in, and then some that I'm pretty interested in that I think a lot of the listeners would be intrigued to hear your opinion and thoughts on.
Hey Keith, no problem at all. Thanks for having me on again. So yeah, my name's Paddy King, Patrick King. I'm from England. Originally moved to America about 7 or 8 years ago. Met an American girl in Spain, and we lived in the UK for a while. Had a little girl, Aurelia, and then when she was about 5 months old, we moved to New York, which is where my wife's from. Um, at that time, I started working for New York Red Bulls, which was brilliant, and that opened a bunch of doors for me. One of which was a job in Arizona as a director of coaching over there. And after doing that for a couple of years, I was offered the job where I currently am in Ohio at a club called Coosa as the main director of coaching. And then in February, just gone, February 2020, February 2020, not what I'm trying to say. I was offered the job of executive director, and that's currently where I am right now.
Awesome. Yeah, so we uh, never did them together, but we did our A licenses at the same place, so in Belfast,
Yep.
Atlantic. And I mean, we've spoken a few times. Your in-depth knowledge when it comes to rondos and positional play and the development of players, and like to sum those up, it's more like um, the strategy of training. So how do you take
Mm.
strategy and turn it? How do you utilize it in training? And some things that were kind of intriguing on my end is your in-depth knowledge of Paco Cirillo. And I just wanted to get in a little bit about that, but maybe there's people out there who don't really know who he is and what he's known for. Could you give
Mhm.
the listener a little bit of a background?
Yeah, sure. He's quite an old guy now, and I think I believe he still is involved with Barcelona, but I don't know how to what extent. I'm not sure if he's working with the first team anymore or anything like that. But he is a sports scientist guy with sort of multidisciplinary um, backgrounds. I think he's worked in a bunch of sports, like a lot of sports science people out of Spain. They are very advanced, and they have a big, an extensive background of knowledge to draw on. He is probably best known. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but probably best known for pushing against the sort of standard training principles that were used, forever and a day, basically. So you've got his training methodology. He refers to it as structured training, which is probably the exact opposite of analytical training. So when you go back to things like the sort of Soviet Union in the 60s, and you look at the way they developed their athletes, they used just pure volume of repetition, and they believed in a microcycle where they would load athletes at one point, taper off at another. um, Paco's philosophy was a little bit more um, holistic. So he would use things like complex systems theory, and he would say that the person isn't made of just physical and mental stuff like that. He kind of would go away from that Cartesian reductionist approach, and he would say no, the body is a complex system made of several structures which all interrelate to a greater or lesser extent depending upon what they're doing. So um, a typical sprint session, right? A typical speed session would be basically players lined up running set distances, 60 meters or so, having a little break at the end, coming back, doing it all over again. And it's not to say that there isn't merit there, but what he would do is he would look to train that in a more holistic way. And he would say, well, can you really sprint at your fastest if, the other parts of your human being are not engaged, right? So you have to be excited about running. So you might need to give a competitive element. You need to be happy about it. So, the results can't matter, and the overall improvement don't matter that much. It's all relative, right? So it's how well you did, not what the actual result was. So there's obviously the physical component, but he might say, well, you need to mix this in with a technical component as well, the coordinative component. So we need it to be involving dribbling, or we need it to be, we need to work your mind as well. So we need some kind of tactical elements to be worked at the same time. So maybe instead of just straight line sprinting, we're going to work it into a small sided game or a larger sided game, and have all these kind of structures of the human being. I think he talks about 6 or 7 worked at the same time to a lesser or greater extent, depending on what the thing is that you're trying to achieve. Obviously, if you're working on sprinting or fitness, you're going to be working more the strength and the conditional elements of the human being, more so than maybe the mental stuff, because you don't really need to switch on just to do sprinting, or you don't need to be cognitively dialed in as much to do sprinting. If you're working on technical stuff, where you're going to work on more like coordinational type stuff, and you might not need the physical stuff to be turned on as much, but you might need the mental stuff to be turned on, because he might be working technical stuff in a 1v1 with a live opponent. So mentally, you do need to be reading cues, you do need to be evaluating where space is and that kind of thing. So you've kind of got two, I don't know if I'd say they're exactly opposed, but two certainly different types of training methodology, from sort of back in the day. And then Paco, I don't know if he was the first or the only person to ever work on these things, but being at Barcelona, he had a very good platform in which to research and then publish his results. He had a bunch of coaches he was lucky enough to work with that took on what he said, and now his methodology has become very popular, and it's a methodology that we work in my club, I personally believe in. And yeah, I'd say that's kind of the long and short of it. A lot more nuance to go into there, but for the purposes of not boring your listeners to tears, that's the kind of 5-minute version of it.
No, I think it's quite intriguing. What I saw, so I think there's 8, and then we'll get a list out in a second. Right. But I saw a quote, I think it was on your blog. Yeah, it was, you can't improve their ability to their ability to perform unless those 8 are trained and overloaded. Those 8 being, I think, biological, cognitive, coordinative, conditional, I believe.
Yep.
Creative, expressive, socio-affective, emotive, volitional, and then psychological. So those 8 making up what is structured training.
Right. And some people would refer to those 8 structures as different names. So biological they might call physical, or that kind of thing. Coordinative they might call technical, but essentially they are the same. They mean the same thing.
Yeah, and it's the motto, right?
Right. It's just a very holistic way to train, and without going into sort of tactical periodization, whether or not they know it or understand it in tactical periodization, really, I think they work similar. They work the human body in similar ways. They treat the athlete as a person, and they talk about holistic development rather than kind of isolated athletic development. So it's not about maximizing your speed, for example. It's more about optimizing your speed in accordance with the other then 7, if there's 8, the other 7 conditional structures. So it's not about maximizing things in isolation, right? We could all just go and do straight line sprint training today and develop a little bit more speed. We could all go in the gym and we could all just strike balls on goal. We could all do all of these things in isolation, but what you're doing is you're only working those things in isolation, and maybe to some extent a few things around them. He would say, well, rather than maximizing these things, let's change the training environment. And I'm not saying that he wouldn't find space or use for just pure sprint training, but it wouldn't be the focus. So he's like, let's find a different training environment and let's try and bring in as many of these structures, as many of these 8 structures as possible, and work them all at the same time. But depending on what the focus of the training is, you work them to a greater or lesser extent. And I hope I've been clear about that. It's a really, you put me on the spot there, Keith, you swine. But it's a very complex subject matter, right? And essentially, those 8 structures are what he says forms the human being. And when you go back in time, you have Descartes and all these kind of reductionist approaches, which we still see in education and coaching today, where you take a thing apart and you go down to its atomic level.
First principle thinking.
Is that all right? That's what it's called. Okay, good man. And then you study that on its smallest atomic level, and then you try and put it back together. And people can't understand why they don't now know how the whole works, right? And that also strays into probably what you would call complex systems theories, where people might know it as chaos theory, where one tiny little thing over here doesn't necessarily have a linear effect, but would have a non-linear effect and can affect or not affect everything else. So just by let's say you're running a training game and you're working on fitness, inverted commas, just fitness, and you increase the amount of time or the amount of reps or something like that because you want to increase the fitness of your players. Well, a linear input and a linear output would say that you change the duration of the bouts to increase the fitness of the player. But non-linearity would say actually you increase the duration of the bouts, you might increase fatigue on the players, you might cause injuries on the players, either that manifest themselves in that session or in games 5 months from now, right, when the season starts to get heavy and the fixtures come thick and fast. So it's that kind of complex theory, complex dynamics.
So the way that I'm with you there, I'm thinking of other ways how we utilize, not how we would describe it. Like you said, first principle thinking, it's one thing both in personal and professional life that I strive to utilize every day. He saw the game, meaning football, saw that it's made up of 22, not including the referees, individuals, took the individual, and then took that individual and broke that individual down, and broke them down into these 8 categories. Then he said, how do I improve or develop these 8 structures to improve the individual? Where, in fact, improving the individual improves the team. And then by improving the team, you improve the game of football.
Yeah, so I guess you're sort of saying what came first, right? The chicken or the egg there. So
I guess kind of, but that's just how it came off in my head. Whether it's right or wrong, that's how I would say it. That's how I envision it from a first principle thinking.
You know what, Keith? And again, I'm not an expert here, right? I'm learning. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here, right? I'm reading other people's work and applying it to my own. So I'm not saying I'm right or wrong here, or you're right or wrong here, but I would say that probably his first starting point was the human being, and I think he tries to make them better first and foremost, and then maybe what emerges is, or what develops is the emergence of these structures within. And then I don't know that he would ever say that he works the structures. I think he works the person and provides them with tasks that maybe stress or tax one system more than another, one structure more than another.
Yeah, I follow.
Yeah, but that's just I've not ever been asked the question in the way you put it there, which that's a great question. I'm just trying to think off on my feet there. I'd say his starting place was the person rather than the structures, and that the structures emerge or develop from working with the person in different environments, whether that environment's more physical in nature, more teamwork related, more technical, more tactical, conditional, physical, all those kinds of things.
So you and I we've spoken in depth a lot about positional play. So knowing that, if we're staying on the subject of structured training, because we'll keep it that rather than referring back to him, but the actual training itself, he's essentially, we'll call him the quote unquote godfather of it, right?
I think that's fair enough. Yeah.
And then structured training itself is adapted various places across the world to their necessary environment.
Yep.
How would you, so you and I have, like I said, we've gone through similar experiences. We actually spoke offline about how those similar experiences in the same place with the same coaches on the same field could be actually very different.
Yep.
Let's say we did a coaching course, not even a coaching course, just a session in general. And let's say the tactical question was defending in a medium block. How in structured training, don't need to go in depth if you want, or in brevity, in structured training, how would you coach, if different, or how would you just go about setting up a session of defending in a medium block if you were following the lines of structured training?
So with structured training, although there are always deviations and necessities, so structured training would say that you work most things through small-sided games or environments rather that are conducive to working all of those structures at the same time, which therefore I think by definition really just by default leaves you with small-sided games. So for example, if you're working on, I'll just use a slightly different example, tactical example than the one you gave. If you're working on crossing, okay, structured training would not really say that you are working with one or two players, a server who plays a diagonal ball into the wide channel, a winger who runs after that ball and then crosses it, and then a striker who tries to finish it, and a goalkeeper who tries to stop it. What structured training would say is that you would probably try to elicit those responses by constraining the players within a small-sided game. So what you're trying to do is work all 4 moments of the game, as well as all 8 structures of the player, again, to a greater or lesser extent. So there might not be, a game that is simply just trying to get crosses into the box, might not be tactically working someone's mind or body as hard as, a full 11v11 game where they're having to deal with their coach's game model and all the 22 interactions on the field. You might be playing a 5v5 game where you've awarded, it's a regular game, so you've got transitional moments, you've got all phases of the game, but you might say, hey, it's 1 goal, 1 point if you score a goal through regular play, it's 5 points if you score it from a cross from wide that is finished with a header or a volley or something like that, or finished within 3 passes of the cross. That is a simpler game, right? 5v5, 2 objectives, 1 to score, 1 to try and maybe get the ball out wide and cross it in and finish. So you're not working necessarily you're not working on heavy tactics with an infinite amount of variables there. Now that's not to say that the other stuff that we talked about, the what you might call analytical training, just having 1 or 2 players, goalkeeper, striker, server, and a crosser, that's not to say that you wouldn't ever use that. And there are times when you want to use analytical training. You might need it for players that are recovering from fitness and are not currently able to fully mix or fully perform an opposed muscle movement or technical movement through risk of injuring themselves. You might have players that are struggling with a little bit of form or technique, and they just need these multiple repetitions. And that's something that another group might go off from the main group, right? Because this would never be prioritized. We sort of talked about this a little bit offline as well. With you would never prioritize isolated training over structured group training, opposed realistic phase training ever as a coach. But you might say, well, you need to do a little bit of this on top of that. So you're going to go off with this fitness coach, this tactical coach, technical coach, whatever, and you're going to work on crossing for 20 minutes. You might need to, the player might be some kind of injury or structural damage to his leg. He might need to practice getting up and down those movements to see, that he might be being observed by fitness coaches to see where, observing the manner of his gait when he's running or walking, right? To have a look at him. You can't really necessarily do that in a fully opposed game where you're working all phases of the game. So not to say there isn't a place for isolated training, but anyone that's ever listened to me speak on the topic, there is a place, but it's hierarchical and it's at the bottom of that hierarchy. And that's just, at the risk of upsetting a few people, that's just how it is, right? So back to the main question, working the tactical concept in a structured environment. Well, there's no defined limit on player numbers. So you can work that from anything up from a rondo through a positional game, preferred situational games to an 11v11. You can coach all within all of those 4 scenarios. But what the coach would want to do is maintain realism so that you are engaging and switching on the player's 8 structures, right? That we're saying that a player is comprised of. If the game becomes purely play wide, cross in, well, then mentally you're checking out. Creatively, you're checking out. Physically, yeah, you might still be switched on a bit. Technically, yeah. Tactically, you're checking out, right? And you kind of go through psychologically. Are you really? I forgot what you called it now. I think you called it. You've got emotional, volitional, and you've got the element
socio-affective, emotive, volitional, psychological, creative,
socio-affectional. Yeah, so the socio-affectional stuff is not going to be engaged as much, right? Because there is no real teamwork. You're not working with everyone on the field. You're not having to take note consciously or subconsciously of where they are, how they're moving, body cues, subliminal, communicational, non-verbal cues. You're just receiving a ball, playing it wide, crossing it in, score it, well done, start again. So that would not be really an example of structured training. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that practitioner of structured training uses only that, right? Because there are times that we talked about a minute ago where you need to branch out, and when the sport is a business and you need to make sure that this guy's not going to get injured again. Hey, we need to have a look at you in a slightly different environment. But would you say that guy is learning? Would you say that guy is developing? Probably not. Probably not as much as if he was in a mixed, opposed, structured training environment. But there are times where he can't do that due to limitations on himself, maybe coming back from injury, maybe he's fatigued, and you know what? The sports science guys have pinged him for an injury, a hamstring injury 4 weeks from now, right? So we're gonna ease his load back and take him out and all those kind of things. So yeah, I'd say that's my kind of garbled explanation of what a structured training.
The thing, not to lead down another rabbit hole, but it sounds like it's very similar to a constraints based led approach.
I think it's the same thing. So
okay.
Excuse me. When I first started looking into non-linear pedagogy and the constraints approach to learning, I wasn't hugely impressed with it as a field of science, and I say that with no disrespect to anyone, but I was like, well, what are you telling me here that's new? This is at its essence restrictions or constraints on small-sided games. Now, as you reread the research, and as you speak to people who are experts in it, you understand the nuance in there. And I won't bore you with all of it now. Maybe we can have a second show. We can talk about it in more depth. But there is much more to it than that. But at its essence, it still is, I believe, what coaches 10 years ago would have called games with restrictions or whatever they were. I've got end zones in the game, so I'm trying to promote forward passes and forward runs. I've got a very wide field, so I'm trying to promote crosses from wide. I've got zones, so I'm looking at progressing through with passing or dribbling, depending on what the other rules are, and all the other kind of task and organizational constraints. But I must say, over the last 18 months, I've become a sort of devotee to non-linear pedagogy and the constraints led approach to learning. I think it's worth its weight in gold.
I'm 100% with you there. I came about it from a different way though. So I was going into training, and I'm preparing, whether it's preparing for myself or for the other coaches who are going to be teaching this. And I'm thinking, man, you go into courses sometimes, and you got to write out like eight to 10 coaching points. Like 8 to 10 coaching points. That's a lot.
Yeah.
I'm thinking on a daily basis, in general life, and just life in general, you maybe try to tackle 3 huge things each day, right? 3 huge in relation to your day.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not finish them, but you feel, if I can get this level done, then it was a good day, right? I'm like, you're asking us to coach 8 to 10 coaching points. How are they going to remember those? And not saying that every player is going to get 8 to 10, but that's just like the generalization, right? So I'm maybe overgeneralizing. So I said, let's look at what the topic is. Here's the topic, whatever it may be, whether it's crossing, defending in a medium block, attacking through width, receiving between the lines, X, Y, and Z, or broken all the way down to attacking and creating 2v1s. And then I go, only 3. Can only coach 3. So I've made a limit, not a matter of can you coach 3? I think you can only coach 3. Can you coach 4? No, only 3. So I go, all right, how do you get 3 across, and how do you keep them engaged? Because you could get your 3 coaching points done in 2.5 minutes, and then you got another hour of what do I go, right? Again, overgeneralizing. So I said, how do you keep them engaged? And it goes exactly with what you're saying: structured training or constraints-led approach, whichever one you want to call it, and you do it that way. You say you get X amount of points for doing this, or you make players start in certain areas, and then they have to progress in a certain way. And then once it gets there, the game opens up a little bit more. Maybe it's 3 versus 2 in one square, looking to play to 2 attackers with 1 defender in behind. And once you play into them, because you're trying to receive between the lines, then the game opens up, and then it becomes a 5v3. Those types of things. And that's really where my bit came from.
So let me just clarify something I may have said a minute ago now. So I think you said to me about the constraints-led approach, and I said it was the same as structured training. That's not what I meant. I'm sorry. And if I didn't say this, apologies. But
no, you're good.
What I meant was structured training would use the constraints-led approach to achieve goals. Not that they're the same thing. So your point about training courses, coaching courses. So that's half of the reason. I think we'll probably talk about it later, but half of the reason that Grant and I are doing what we're doing is because we were just not happy with all the courses we've been on. And between us, we've been lucky enough to be college coaches, Red Bulls, club directors. So we've been on our fair share, right? We just nothing special about that. We've just been sent on these courses. So we've experienced a ton between us. And I think apart from our UEFA courses, we both kind of universally said that we weren't very impressed with courses we've been on, and that's no offense to anyone. But then you come back to the question, well, how would is it the course's fault because they've got all these random coaches who don't have a shared philosophy or shared game model? You've got random players bust in to play, and some days you don't have players at all. The coaches play, and one coach might be 60, one might be 19. How do you get a cohesive approach there? And maybe you can't, but the way we look at it is, so what we're trying to do is, I guess, simplify what coaching is, but give it more nuance. So increase the tactical understanding of it. So when I did the last US soccer license course I did, and it has deliberately been the last US soccer course I did because it was terrible. And I don't mind saying that because I believe they've changed a lot since then and they're still improving, and good on them. But it was my C license probably about 7 years ago, and it was awful. I was asked to go in and coach a random topic with random players, and I was given a fixed amount of time to do it. And I was explicitly told I could not fix anything technical, just tactical. All right, that was the big thing. Don't tell a guy to receive on his back foot. Why are you telling him that? It's irrelevant. Talk about tactical elements. And that never left me because I find it impossible to correct tactical defects if my players don't know how to receive a ball, they don't know how to pass a ball, they don't know any of what you might call the universal concepts of positional play. So, like you're scanning, you're dismarking, you're receiving on your back foot, receiving across your body. If you had to label them as technical, you might do so, but we call them universal concepts, which are really concepts that apply to the individual. So not just technical, right? Scanning, but on an individual level, receiving on your back foot, just the one player, right? That kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. How do you fix the collective positional play concepts, which this course might have been referring to as tactics? How do you fix them if on that fundamental kind of individual level, your players don't know how to receive and pass a ball? They don't know to not stare at the ground. They don't know that they should check their shoulder. They don't know that a pass that is played to their front foot has a different intention than one that is played to their back foot. How do they know what the tactical outcome should be or how to fix it if they can't even dribble, pass, control, look, shoot, receive, dismark, all these things? And the answer is they can't. They just can't. So what we're trying to do is coach now through 2 or 3 different lenses. So if you take your game model as your starting point, you obviously coach within that. So for me, I don't play a direct game. I'm not ever going to coach my centre back to play a pointless 70-yard pass. Now, that's not to say that 70-yard pass might not be on sometimes, but that is not something I'm going to say here, hey, John, just practice pinging 60-yard, 70-yard balls for an hour. That's not going to happen, right? So you've got everything you do is flavored and colored and constrained to some extent by your game model, right? Then you go in and you have the actual session you're coaching. So for me and for Grant, and we've talked about this probably for about a year now, we're looking at coaching probably 3 different things: universal concepts, collective concepts, and then maybe tactical or team level principles that you might work from your game model. So the universal concepts will be, let's say we're coaching a simple 4v4 plus 3 rondo, right? Very beginning of your session. I am going to tell these guys to work on back foot receiving. I am going to tell these guys to work on scanning, getting their head up. Can they penetrate on the individual level? Do they need to play a first, second, or third line pass to either penetrate or maintain possession of the ball, conserve possession of the ball? And all these kind of similar related universal individual concepts like dismarking to rupture, dismarking to support. Mm-hmm. On the collective level, we're going to clip all these together and now try and execute tactical strategies, for want of a better word, right? Collective concepts that might involve 2 or 3 players or 3 or 4 players. So a third man movement, right? So playing the ball, I think some people call it up, back, and through, right? That you play that ball into someone, you get it back.
Third man pattern, that specific
third man pattern. Yeah. So is that a team level tactic if you're only working it with 2, 3, 4 players? Probably no, but it's bigger than the individual universal concepts. So we're referring to that as collective concepts. So in the 4v4+3 rondo, already you've worked on all those universal principles constantly. Universal concepts you're working on every session, all the time. They're not cognitively taxing. They shouldn't be physically taxing. They're habits. You're trying to form habits. Using those, you're now talking to players about executing collective concepts, right? So group level tactics, you might say, and then which like the third man movement, find the free man in a rondo, right? You can always do that. Penetrate, receive between two lines, you can do that. Receive behind a defensive line. These are like collective positional play. So you've got your universal individual positional play concepts, then you've got your collective group level positional play concepts, and you can work all of those in a rondo. Then what you might go on to do is, if your topic is, let's say, switching play, right? A very vague topic. Well, let's say that is your coaching course topic. Well, now you can go on and you've activated the players in the rondo. You've worked on the universal collective concepts, and you might have favored the collective concepts that lead seamlessly into switching play, right? So you might have worked on finding the free man. You might have worked on attracting defenders to the ball on the left to create the free man on the right, and then moving the ball to find him. But you're only doing that using 2, 3, or 4 players. Now you go into your positional play game where you're increasing the complexity, you're increasing the numbers, the space, and the tactical requirements. You're saying, well, now we actually are looking to switch play. So you've got 7v7, 8v8, right, 9v9, whatever you're working on, and you're taking the universal and collective concepts worked in the rondo. You're now applying them to the positional play game and adding on that extra layer of full-on team tactics, switching play, and you then coach that. So to say, for them guys to say to me that you could only coach your topic, so you can't correct any collective errors, you can only coach, you can't coach technical deficits, you can't go and correct those universal concepts, but they still expect me to produce, as a result of that, the team level switching of play tactical outcome, is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. I can say to my players, hey, we're going to go work on switching of play today, off you go. And they might come up with this on their own to a greater or lesser extent. But if I can't go in and fix the minutiae, the nuts and bolts, the principles, and it might even be, your collective principles might form part of your, without going off on a tangent, part of your game model principles and stuff like that. If you can't go in and correct that, how on earth do you expect to get the real minute details, right? If you can't correct a player's ability to receive and pass a ball, how are you working on a real fine sub principle level of getting the ball from player A to player B and how to do it? Well, the answer is you can't. So for them to say that in a coaching course and die on that hill, I mean, we all got rinsed out about, people could not help but go in and say, pick your head up, receive on the back foot there to let the ball come across. And then people could, yeah. And they were like, they'd blow the whistle and you'd get penalized. And there was some guy there that was, just a terrible instructor who he didn't know enough to go in and critique what some of these coaches that did know what they were doing were doing. So he had a few things that he was going to die. He was going to die on that hill. Every time I see you coach a technical aspect, I'm going to ping you on it. And it became a bit of a laughing stock because people just understood instantly, or across the course of the week, that he didn't know enough to assess or correct us. So why are we here? So that really resonated with me. It stuck with me forever. I'll never forget that course as long as I live. It was brutal. It was 100 degrees heat as well, and I had to put up with this nonsense. So Grant has had similar experiences. So we sat down and we sort of, theorized it, and then added our anecdotal experience, and then went out and tested it and tried it and worked it and reworked it. And we think that actually you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And really, you look at someone like Pep, you look at Paco and all his structured training, you look at you talked about Albert Puig and his game, his positional play principles. The stuff's there. The stuff is really there. You just have to work out how you're going to do it. And these artificial constraints put on by, these so-called experts at US soccer, where you can't correct a technical defect, you could only go and work the team level. Nonsense. I mean, just stop talking at that point. The information's there. Take it, put it together, practice it with your own team, and that's kind of what we've done by putting together King Knight Coaching Education, is to take this and rationalize it and put it into a working, usable format where coaches can, pick up the principles and the concepts that they like and want to play with, and figure out how to use them in a coaching environment. Simple as that.
That's awesome. Yeah, we'll talk about that further. I'm 100% behind what you're saying there. Use different verbiage, but we have the same mentality when it comes to improve the individual at, in your wording now, on the minute level, and then build up from there. But you also have to know how they relate. So it's not just, receive on the back foot. So why are you receiving in the back foot? And then you can elaborate how it connects to 2 or 3 players, and how it connects to 7 or 8 or 9 players.
You've absolutely nailed it there. That's exactly it, Keith. To a word, you have to understand, starting from the individual up to the 11v11, how these concepts are related and the effect that they have. So we talked about chaos theory and linear versus non-linear, right? Input. So a player that can't receive on his back foot is potentially catastrophic to a tactical team endeavor, because it could fail at the very first step. So everyone else might be in the right position waiting to receive these balls. They've all scanned, the free man's been created over on the flank. We've attracted the players to the ball over here, and that very first pass goes to a player that hasn't received across his back foot, or hadn't checked over his shoulder, hasn't scanned his environment, and he's unaware of everything else, and it all falls down because of what you might call a technical or universal concept breakdown, and it affects everything else, blows up as a result of it. 100%.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with someone a few weeks ago. It was actually a player, and everyone, with everything going on in this world, but they're like, I want to get back on the pitch. I want to play 11v11, and I go, I hear you. That's what we all that's where you eventually get to, right? Everyone eventually gets to 11v11 who continues to play football, because that's where the pros are. That's where they want to play. But at the same time, I said, okay, if we do that, do you feel like your foundations as an individual and within small group settings, so let's say 3 to 5 to 7 players, is strong enough? And I said, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, an 11v11 team that tactically can do things might be able to cover up for pillars that are faulty.
Yeah.
And you're not being the best player you can, because you may just be like a freak of nature as an athlete. So you are just bombing them, and you're athletic, and you're getting over them, and you might have a little bit of technical ability. But when you play against that top team, you can't seem to break through that glass. And you're like, is it a tactical mistake? And everyone's trying to figure it out. And then when you're only training in these big numbers all the time, you're like, what's the problem? Tactics are wrong. Change the formation. He shouldn't be playing center forward. He needs to play right wing. Wrong holding midfielder. And then if you look at it from a first principle thinking, I hear a reoccurring theme today. The universal and collective, from your terminology, concepts that are faulty. And those are the principles that make up the players. When I say the players, are those players that we all love to watch, the professional players.
For sure.
It's not, they are great as a right wing in a 4-3-3 formation and doing X, Y, and Z. He goes, no, because they know which technique to use in the right small-sided situation. Because although you're playing 11v11, how often is 11v11 the reason why you are successful in a given scenario? Seldom, very few to none. It's usually a 4-on-4, a 5-on-5, maybe a 7 if a team's extremely compact, right? It's usually that size number scenario that leads to a victory.
that's a really interesting point, and I think it's one that we try our hardest, right, in a limited 180-page book to illustrate in the Rondo book, is those collective, without universal concepts, there is no collective. There are no collective concepts. And you're right. How often is it the endeavor of the full complement of that team, the all 11 players, that result or cause a positive effect, a goal or a goal scoring opportunity? There's quite often breaks in play, and okay, the ball might have started with a goalkeeper, but actually it was intercepted 2 or 3 times by other players before we scored it. So that play was built by the 8, the 10 striker and one of the wingers or something, right? 4 players. And what they've done is they've executed something, right, which we would hope or say are collective concepts in order to break that line and get that goal scoring opportunity. So the 10 might have played a penetrative ball into the 9. The 9's received in front of the centre back. He's played a third man movement to the 11 running in behind, just a little one touch glance, and it's the 11 who's had the opportunity on goal. Nothing to do with the goalkeepers or the centre backs or the full backs or the opposition winger. It was a group of players executing collective concepts which are built from universal concepts. And another thing is, when you talk about technique, I use the word technique because it's just always been there, but I'm not sure how much I believe in that word as a standalone word, because I personally don't think you can work it on its own. So it's a collection of the other structures. It's a it's a result of its environment. It's all these things, that you talk about in complex system theories, you talk about in non-linear pedagogy, constraints-led approach, structured training, tactical periodization. Is technique, right? Taking a touch past a player to set yourself up for a shot, is that a technique, or is that the manifestation of all of these things coming together? And that's a rabbit hole, right? That I'm not gonna.
I was gonna say, you said that. I'm warming my hands up. I'm like, let me get comfortable.
Oh man, take it away. Yeah, whatever. But is it that, Keith, or is that just people being over? There's a big tendency for people in soccer, especially in America now, to kind of over theorize everything, overcomplicate everything, and you sometimes you just can't get a straight answer out of people nowadays because they just disappear down these rabbit holes. But really, if you were to say that actually technique is not just a purely
isolated incident,
yeah, right. It's not just the thing that it looks like it is, right? It's not just your foot coming out to take a touch. It's that's the tip of the arrow. That's the culmination of all the things that have gone into it, either in the moment or in previous practices that are, basically all the things we talked about in Cerullo's structured training, those eight structures. It's the constraints-led approach to learning. It's nonlinear pedagogy. It's all of those things that sort of manifest themselves in the moment as a touch past a player to shoot. Then, well, what is technique? Like, is it important? Is isolated training even a thing that you need to do to get better? And that's a real question that needs to be answered, not just people on Twitter trying to shout over each other and who can shout the hardest, and giving these randomized examples of, well, I've been doing this for 20 years, and in those 20 years I've had 20 professional players come through my isolated training academy. Well, if I worked with players for 20 years in London, when you've got all those academies around professional players and it's the sport to do, I would hope that I have a couple of players that turn pro come through me as well, whatever I do, right? If I'm the guy that sells the hot dogs on the way to the game, I might have sold hot dogs to to future pro players, but are the two related? I don't know. So I think it's a really interesting question. There are a bunch of studies and research on it. People just seem unwilling to receive it and appreciate it because you have to really open your brain up to get your mind around it. You have to read a few books. You have to be prepared to look words up in dictionaries that you don't understand. and you have to be prepared to put aside what you might call, is it survivorship biased or whatever, right? Where I've had 500 players in my time, and 2 of them have made it. What does that mean? What about the other 498? What's the most important number there? So yeah, it's a huge topic, mate, and a really important one, and it's one that I feel fairly passionate about, which is why my approach is the polar opposite of isolated skill repetition. I'm more of a holistic trainer, complex system theory, structured training, tactical periodization, game models, concepts, universal, collective, rather than dribbling to beat people all the time, round cones and that kind of stuff.
I'm with you here. I am.
Good.
But I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Does there have to be an answer?
I mean, I'm not the expert, right? I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PhD. No, I'm not trying to cop out. I'm not a PhD.
No, I got you.
Whatever you call this, right?
There needs to be an answer with it, right? So well, it needs to be researched and so forth. Good, I'm good with it. And this is me playing, I guess, devil's advocate, other side of the coin.
Yeah, sure.
Because I feel like I do it sometimes. I sit, I'm like, do I need to do that? Or like the bit of when you are working on technique, because there are times when you're doing passing patterns, but there's a reason behind the passing pattern, right?
Mm-hmm.
You may do passing patterns so people understand why they do it. And there's moments in it, and you're hitting part of the 8 categories, but maybe there's not a physical defender, but they are imagining it, right? And I see validity in that because they're understanding why they do certain things, and then you introduce the defender, and now the time and pressure is ramped up, so they have to execute it at a higher speed, not just go out there, pass the ball back and forth, but there's an actual one is more imaginative, and then the other one is you can physically see it. And I'm thinking, like, is this not structured enough? You know what I mean when I say not structured, in terms of like, is it too block training? There we go, that's the word, block training. Is it too block training? It needs to be less block training. I'm like, what is there a finite line to where block training is, or is it just infinite and you could just take it forever?
So what I would say to you is, right, and I'm never going to push my opinion on you, but I know what I know because I've done the research. I know what I know because I've got anecdotal experience, and eventually you marry that up and you come to a conclusion, right? You fall on one side of the debate or the other, or you fall in the middle, or whatever it is, but you fall somewhere. When you talk, I read someone on Twitter who kind of threw his toys out the pram the other day a little bit and unfollowed me. I saw he was talking about imagining a defender behind you, and I just thought, well, why not just have a defender behind you? Because by imagining it, okay, and if we're talking about, we could talk about this from any lens at all, but we've said earlier on this podcast that we're looking at structured training, right? That's something I believe in, and structured training, the way you execute it or go about delivering it, is and can be based on non-linear pedagogy and constraints-based approaches. So if we have that as our starting point, if you imagine something rather than it actually being there, you're already changing the way that you will react to it. For example, I'll give you a very, very simple example, right? And I hate to do these random examples that aren't football related because they sound very philosophical, and it's not meant to be. It's just because I'm tired and I'm trying to think of a good example for your listeners. If I told you to walk a tightrope for 10 meters above Niagara Falls, or I told you to walk along a line on a gym hall floor for 10 meters.
I read this, by the way. Go ahead.
Oh, I just made that up. Okay, that's brilliant.
Oh, but there's something that's almost, it triggered something in my brain that maybe it's not word for word the same.
Yeah.
But I think I know what you're talking about. That was on Twitter. But anyways, indulge.
You know what? Maybe that's influenced my thinking then. But that's the example I just came up with. You would, no matter how much you imagined or visualized the latter example, you would never feel or react the same way as with the first. With the first one, you would use every sinew in your body to stop yourself from falling. You would engage muscles that you didn't know you had to stop yourself falling off that rope. You would find balance and core strength that you didn't know was available to you. Whereas on the second one, if you started to fall off balance, you would just put your foot out onto the rest of the gym floor, and guess what? You don't fall to your death. Happy days. So why train one way that is not representative of how you would play? Now, like I said to you before, and this is the other side of the argument, right? So I'll do the devil's advocate bit for you. If you have 15 sessions a week, right? Not all physical sessions, right? Classroom, recovery, injury prevention, physical maintenance, tactical, blah, 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 right? You're in a professional environment where 7 days a week, you are working with your players, and you want to do an exceptionally low impact, low intensity, low cognitive session because it's, I don't know, the day after a game or 2 days after a game. Could you do a scenario where you're imagining something? I guess you could. But then you have to take that and weigh it against what you win and what you lose by doing so. And if you come down on the opinion that I win or gain more by doing something where I know none of my players can get injured, blah, 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 and I still kind of get the concept out that I was trying to get from them, well, that's a win. And if that's a win in your book and you're the head coach, well, that's all that matters. If you go the other way and say, no, because I've lost realism, I've lost intensity, I've lost working all 8 of those structures that Cerullo talks about, and that is the hill I die on, well, then you've got your answer there, right? You go for the other option. So that is how I approach training. Nothing I do, and parts of this are taken from Vita Frade and his tactical periodization. Nothing I do in an ideal world, obviously I work with youth players predominantly, but it is done in practice that is separate from the game or the game moments or my game model. So I'm not doing anything isolated, I'm not doing anything unrealistic, and I'm not doing anything unrelated. Even on recovery days, or let's say we've had it's been a real tense period of time and we've had 2 weekends of 4 games in each tournament, and we need a little bit of a rest, and cognitively the guys are tired, physically they're tired. That's fine. Come up with activities that still work your principles, come up with activities that are still opposed, just adjust some other variables like work to rest ratios, how long your bouts are going to be, how many sets or reps you're going to do, the size of the area, the blah blah blah, the numbers of players involved in the games, increase them or decrease them to affect different energy pathways, different muscle groups, different tensions. Don't come up with these fictitious scenarios like imagine there's a defender behind you, because really that is just the philosophical highfalutin equivalent of doing a dribble against a red stationary cone. There is no difference in my opinion.
I'm with you there. Man, I think that's the note that I want to leave that on. I feel like if we take off this subject here, we're going to continue down about it. I think this is a lot of info. But before we do go, spoken about your book. If you want, you can release your date. I'd love to see if we can set up a time to come on and do a review on the book. I think that would be really good because we've given a little taste here and there, but maybe devote a little bit more time and get into it. I want to get it out there. And then wherever you're able to sell it, let me know. I'll get it out there as well. That way I can do my part here, because I know there's plenty of people who now are just itching to get more information, and there's no better way than to contact us as well as purchase your book.
Oh, mate, thank you. I appreciate that. So the book is due out September 1. We're currently proofreading it and working on some of the logistical stuff that makes it available. So we've gone away from Amazon self-publishing. We're releasing it as a regular book, and that has a little bit of extra work attached to it. But September 1's the date. The book is basically rondos and how you can teach, instruct, understand, develop universal and collective concepts through them, which then, takes you to a very nice segue or lead into positional play games and tactical games and sort of preferred situational games, those kind of things. And it came about because of some of the stuff you and I have already talked about previously, just being unhappy with coach education. It's not to say that Grant and I have the answer to every question and that we will do everything perfectly right. But there has to be better available to some of these shoddy, almost outsourced US soccer courses where it's whoever's available goes and teaches whatever they feel like on any given day. And so we've tried to consolidate and give official, objective references based on game, model, and positional play principles and concepts, and how you can take them and use them through a rondo. What really started the rondo as being the first edition of our educational resources was it's something that is so commonly mentioned and so commonly spoken about in US soccer in particular. You speak to any coach, right? They'll tell you now, oh yeah, we use rondos, we use them as warm-ups, we use them as keep away games, we use them as this. But ask a coach why he's doing the rondo, what he's trying to get out of it, what his players have learned, what concepts is he teaching through it, how does it apply to the next part of his practice, how does it apply to the weekend's game? And I think you're basically left with a bunch of people scratching their heads, giving you generalized, non-specific answers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just basically a primer put together that takes everything out here in the ether, right? Everything that coaches sort of know vaguely and pulling it into one place and allowing them to basically pick the book up, read it, take you a couple of days to read it, session plans in the back, and how the concepts can be used through these particular rondos, how they can be taught and how they can then be applied into the collective and sort of team level concepts of the game on the weekend. And that's pretty much the long and short of it. So I'd love your feedback and opinion on it, Keith, as always.
100%. All right. I love it. Well, Paddy, I appreciate you coming on today, and we'll definitely be having a few more conversations in the near future.
Hey, no problem, man. Always a pleasure. Take care.
Take care.